Greetings to you. My name is Tara Brabazon and I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to Vlog 226. The lecture, Does Digitization, or Digitization, does the lecture. Team, this is big. I've worked in online learning since 1997, and I've been angry about online learning since 1997, and that's why there were a few days there in March 2020 when all these people magically discovered online learning and the online lecture that I pretty well lost the will to live. Online learning has been around for decades, and it has been studied and researched very well. Qual and quant studies, some remarkable theoretical work, a lot of attention to the development of literacies and scaffolding. So at the end of this trilogy on the lecture for Olivia, a wonderful suggestion, thank you my love, it seemed really appropriate to think about revisioning, the revisioning of the lecture through digitization. And as always perhaps with me, this is a story of buoyant optimism and of course dark despair. And so I'm going to present both in this gig today. I'm going to set you up with our theoretical model for the digitised lecture, and then I'm going to look at the 5 strengths and also the 5 weaknesses of online learning, but specifically the digitised lecture. So the theoretical model I just wanted to put out there for you, and I've done research on this and publish on it if you'd like to read on it further, but I want you to imagine or summon a square. And that square, and this will come as a surprise to you, is cut into 4 quadrants, not 3, 4 quadrants. And in those 4 quadrants are analog, digital, synchronous, and asynchronous. Now, each of these 4 squares talk to each other in really interesting and innovative ways. They also have specific relationships that enable, support, or repress particular behaviours or learning strategies. So, digital synchronization, digital synchronous is Skype, Zoom, Collaborate. Digital asynchronous is email. Analog synchronous is the face-to-face meeting, or indeed the analog real-time lecture in a classroom. And analog asynchronous is sitting in a beanbag and reading material or reviewing your notes on the lounge suite at home. So there's all sorts of different applications, approaches and behaviours that occur when we think about those 4 squares. Thinking about those 4 squares is incredibly useful and productive, and you can have a real play there. It's great stuff. So I just want to whack in 4 quick definitions for you. Obviously, synchronous is in real time, so sharing real time and real communication. Asynchronous is a delay between one communication event and another. So what we're doing now is asynchronous. So I'm recording this, I edit it, upload it, and you engage with it later. Asynchronous. Then you've got analog. Now I love this word. The etymology of analog comes from biol, from med, but also has some very strong usage in internet studies. But analog, I think, is best described for you as a metaphor through the analog clock. And that tells us a lot about the etymology of analog. Analog as an adjective refers to a way of representing data sets. And the way that we represent data is on a continuous scale. So think of our clock face. So the arm is continually moving, analog, unlike the digital clock where it's 102, click 103, click 104. So it doesn't have that snap of change. It's smooth. So analog, through this definition, is that which is not digital, and it therefore has been used very strongly in internet studies for, again, about 20 years to talk about physical objects and bodies, and those physical objects and bodies that continue to move in physical space rather than digitization, pixelation, screens. So analog and digital are binary oppositions. Bodies, screens. But it's also used pejoratively, so you're so analog supposedly means you're not digital and therefore you're not very modern. Okay, so digital engages the culture, media, the economy, and it's founded on binary numbers. The binary code allows information to move through space with very little redundancy because of packet switching, and therefore ideas can move at speed through space. So the characteristic of digitization is mobility. Information moves. And therefore the point in thinking about analog and digital, synchronous and asynchronous in a lecture is it allows us to ponder the lecture differently, I think, as a site, as a node for communication. And it means we have to talk about the architecture of identity and identities of learners and teachers, but also the architectures for learning. Yeah. So through this vlog, just remember these 4 sections for me, because we're going to be playing with those terms in the next little bit. But the only caveat I'd commence this vlog with is don't let the availability of technology determine your choices. Let your learning outcomes, let your learning goals determine the appropriate technology. Okay, so let's get into this. Let's start with the 5 great strengths of the digital lecture. Obviously they are goth infused, so they're really positive, but sometimes they're not. So the 5 great gifts of the digital lecture, and they are Dinkum. 1, the digital lecture is flexible. Now flexibility is one of those words. It's a word that seemed to be benevolent. So if you're flexible, you're adaptable, you're agile, you do yoga. But flexibility in teaching and learning does reveal problems. And I'm going to return to this matter when we're dealing with the disadvantages of the online lecture. But I just want to put one stat out there that may change your life. It certainly changed mine. Only 1/3 of students enrolled in an online course watch the lectures. 1/3. So in other words, 2/3 of a student group intend to watch the lecture and never do. So as you can see, when you've got an analog lecture, so people have to go into a room, yes, attendance can be a problem, but you can see everybody and you can do a roll, as I have done. Of course, a lot of universities also have swipe cards. So when a student goes into a lecture theatre, they swipe themselves in so you know they're present, and an automated email comes to them if they didn't swipe into the lecture. So there's a lot more accountability for an analog lecture theatre. So therefore we've got to start to think about and manage the relationship between discipline, motivation and the online lecture. Because the research shows, and again this is very clear over 20 years, that online learning for first year inexperienced university students is a real problem, because students don't have the academic literacy or the disciplinary literacy to be disciplined enough to sit and watch an online lecture when there's actually no time imperative to do so. So a synchronous lecture, you arrive, you have to be there. If you're not there, you've lost it, it's gone. So therefore, my argument is the more inexperienced the student, the more synchronous the learning event should be. Okay, so for experienced learners, online lectures are terrific because they know how to learn, they're motivated, and they can move that material around that timetable, which could be paid employment, caring responsibilities, a family, right? So that's why online lectures work so well at a master's level and also for professional development, because these students, they're motivated, they've got discipline, they know how to organise their learning, they know how to manage their time. But first year students in universities are still learning these skills. And the research shows, and here we go, there is a direct relationship for first year students between attendance in a lecture and the final grade. And the drop off in those grades is just dreadful. So if first year students miss 2 lectures out of 12, their grade collapses to a C. Boof! Hang on to yourself. Once they've only got to 8 lectures, so they've missed 4 in a semester of 12 lectures, the student fails. The student fails. So as you can see, without the timetable, the synchronous analog commitment, first year students in particular suffer. So therefore, when you as an educator, you're considering the digital lecture, remember firstly to start with the level and the experience of your students. For experienced learners, the flexibility of online learning is tremendous because we can fit it around our lives. It's great. Every Saturday morning, I do some LinkedIn learning and it's tremendous. Saturday morning, I do a session, I learn something, it's tremendous, right? But for students that are yet to gain that discipline, the flexibility is really quite poisoned. So let's continue with the positivity, shall we? And move to 2. Digitization gives us diversity. You've heard me go on and on and on and on about the 3 Ds: digitization, deterritorialization, and disintermediation. Deterritorialization uses disintermediation to move ideas through space. It's terrific. And disintermediation allows us as teachers to talk with students directly without corporate interests or indeed universities being terribly involved. What we're doing here is disintermediation. This is me in my house at the moment talking to you. No one else is involved but us. Great. So what happens is academics can create born digital objects, podcasts, tweets, blogs, online lectures, pencasts, and recognise therefore the diversity of student needs and the diversity of student literacies. So let me give you an example, and I'm using an example from physics. As someone who is married to a professor of physics, I have been in awe of what I have seen in terms of scaffolding of learning this year. I cannot believe what I have seen. And, you know, like most academics, Jamie had to make a transition to online lectures very, very quickly for first year students. So week 2, he was in a classroom, a real classroom, delivering a lecture. Week 3, everything was online. Bang, bang, quick change. So Jamie delivered and delivers, he's an award-winning teacher, delivers fabulous online lectures in first year physics. But he was very aware that the students who come to physics, perhaps more than any other subject, come from a diversity of backgrounds and are often pretty unprepared in one or all areas they require to know about. So he could complain about students being underprepared, or we could do something. So as we discussed in our first variable on flexibility, first year lectures and first year students pose particular problems here. So he did something. Jamie developed what he called pencasts, and they exist outside of the lecture. So he delivers a lecture and things exist around it, and for Jamie they were pencasts. So for students who may be underprepared in mathematics, and let's be honest, that's all of us, he showed a step-by-step guide through the mathematical equations, right? So this means he talks about an equation in an online lecture, so here it is, but then develops a pencast to show the students who have had no idea about that equation how it operates. So what is a pencast? Well, a pencast involves an extraordinary pen, a magic pen, and a magic piece of paper. And what happens is, through this pen, we are writing out an equation, a design, anything you can think of, and the lecturer, the teacher, is speaking while that's occurring. So it means as students engage with the pen strike, so the pen strike happens, they can hear their academic, their teacher, speak what is occurring in the equation, how the equation is occurring. So they can actually hear the teacher talk while they see the equation being written out. Amazing. Another example I've used is I have for a lot of years, decades actually, recorded a very short podcast. I'm thinking 2 to 3 minutes that's attached to every single lecture that I deliver. And I call that an orienting podcast. All it is a student can hear the big idea of the lecture that week, maybe the major theorist, maybe a big question they need to think about. And why I do that is so by the time a student comes into a lecture theatre, particularly a first year lecture, they have a vibe, they have a context, they have a shape, they are oriented for learning before the event occurs. So that's one of the great gifts, I would argue, of sound for the learning environment. So that's also, I think, something of the gift of digitisation, because we gain that scaffolding, the alternative pathways through learning. And the model I've used to describe the examples, in many ways, what I've just talked about there, is the Octopus model of learning. So the online lecture is the head of the octopus, but to enable the diversity and the differentiation of learning, the octopus has those tentacles that reach out. So they may be visual, they may be sonic media that engages particular groups and allows them to engage with the head, with the online lecture. But they need the scaffolding to get themselves there. But like the tentacles, they reach out to different groups. Good stuff, and they're connected to the head. So 3, online learning creates profound consciousness in interface management. This is great. If digitisation is taken seriously, and it should be, then it changes absolutely everything. And that everything includes the lecture. Too often, through the last 20 years, 25 years really, academics, we had a course, we had a curriculum, we had a syllabus, and the digital elements were sort of added to it. So we ran our course as normal and we plugged in some digital bits, right? So we PDF'd our study guide and we uploaded that into Blackboard. You know, PowerPoint slides were shared. There was a discussion fora that hardly anybody used. But actually, of course, if we take digitisation seriously, it changes absolutely everything. It is a root and branch transformation of teaching and learning. It's not a marinade to an already successful analogue learning experience. Because, as I've argued, live analogue lectures, they're tremendous. They are tremendous. And live digital lectures can be tremendous. But the weird thing is they may not show a lot of similarity to the analogue mother. Therefore, we really have to start again with the basics at this powerful moment, because digitisation demands that we as teachers, we as learners, show great and profound consciousness in the selection and the management of our interfaces. The problem of online learning for 20 years has been that it's been configured as a Fordist enterprise. So you get your content and you slam that content into a standardised Fordist learning management system. So this was often described as a top-down managerial decision. Get your content online. What are you doing? Get your content online. Now, every word in that phrase troubles me. Firstly, knowledge is not content. Sort yourself out. So, and how are you actually getting that material online? How much time have you been given? What support have you been given? What resources are available to develop that online content? And of course, this is really getting is like the Australian word just. You know, Australians, I love how Australians use the word just. You know, why don't you just go and paint the house? You know, why don't you just go and develop world peace? Just, great word. And really, that's what getting is like. Just go and get that stuff online. Get it online. Like the online environment is sort of like a supermarket trolley, and you're just putting it back to the sort of trolley return. Like, just get it online, and it's done. The online learning environment is huge, and it's fabulous and it's spectacular. It's not one thing. It's customised, it's bespoke, it's post-fortis. And yes, it can be managed by corporations like Amazon, Apple or Google, but there are a lot of very interesting proliferation of applications now that can enable information literacy, can loan us some literacies until we can develop them on our own. So, you know, this stuff about just get this stuff online quickly is nonsense. And that's how online learning's operated for 25 years. Online lectures are different. They ask us to pause, be quiet, to reflect on the best use of our interfaces. So synchronous or asynchronous, that's the first big issue. How are you going to manage the clock in your teaching? Is flexibility useful for that particular group of students, for that particular course, for the knowledge system that you're trying to create? What platforms are best? So for synchronous screens, the diversity, we've got Skype, we've got Zoom, we've got Collaborate, we've got Teams, we've got Facebook Live, we've got YouTube, and most of us found during COVID, I'm sure you were the same, we were bouncing, in one day, in one morning, we were often bouncing between all these different interfaces, right? So therefore, what are your learning goals? What mode of screen engagement is best for you? The gift of the online lecture is that we can design learning. We can develop online learning outcomes, careful assessment, and then find the best interfaces to make those connections. Now, it may be analog synchronous lectures, great. It might be short digital micro lectures, again, great. But the most important moment, I think, happens for teachers when they realise the digitisation does change everything. And what it changes most is the reflection on your teaching and learning. We have to understand the difference between learning or instructional media and communication media. A Fordist deployment of a learning management system is really the worst outcome we can have in online learning. So yes, take the skeleton of a learning management system like Moodle, which is probably better than the rest, but then design the flesh and the blood and the bone in a way that shapes learning for your specific cohort of students. So what's another advantage of the online lecture? It's a biggie. Online lectures can change the whole definition of what a lecture is. Let me go right back to the arrival of the iPod in September 2007. This piece of hardware changed popular music because it changed our very definition of a sonic artifact. All of a sudden, through disintermediation, a track of music could be 5 seconds in length or 15.5 hours in length. All of that was downloadable. So listeners suddenly were not reliant on radio or music journalism or music programs on TV to tell us about the hits and what we should be buying, because suddenly the entire music industry became the long tail. We could buy pretty well anything, download anything and enjoy it on our own terms. So the diversity of sonic materials that are now available to us is stunning. And it arches far beyond popular music to sonic art, sonic architecture, to what I've often called the unpopular music of the past. So it means our sonic literacies changed. The online lecture is the same. It is the iPod moment. At its best, it'll unpick the very genre of a lecture to create a post-lecture, a reflexive space on the lecture. It will re-emerge from this digital imagining very different, in a very different form. At its most basic, we'll start to ask the question, should a lecture be 50 minutes in length? Now, if it's in a timetable in a room, we've all got used to that. So 50 minutes, 10 minute setup, 50 minute, 50 minute, 50 minute, efficient. But lectures outside of that timetable and outside of a room, to paraphrase the Smiths, oscillate wildly. They can be a 10-minute explosion of a concept or a really deep and careful and long presentation on a topic. Now, I've selected, just to give you an example of this, optics, because again, I watched Jamie do this in real time this year in first year. So he started, because of the speed of getting stuff online because of COVID, he started replicating what he did in a synchronous analog lecture. So week 2, he delivered it in a room. Week 3, it was online, him upstairs recording it to a screen. And week 3 was very similar to what he would have delivered in a lecture theatre. But then he worked out something very, very quickly by week 4. He didn't have to do that. So very quickly he departed from the 50-minute lecture format. He started to deliver short, sharp bursts of 15 minutes of particular concepts. That was great. And then, of course, optics happened, I think about week 10 or week 11. And he said, you know what, I've never done this lecture properly in my career because it's never fitted into 50 minutes. Optics is not a 50-minute topic. So when it's done properly, it takes 70 minutes. So you know what, I'm not going to dumb this down. I'm going to gently and carefully work through this topic for students, and it's going to take 70 minutes, and they can pause it and have a cup of coffee and come back, but it's 70 minutes. And that's the gift of the online lecture. It's a Bauhaus moment. Form follows content. So why does a lecture have to be 50 minutes? And the answer is it doesn't have to be. It can change our very expectations of what a lecture is, what a gift digitization gives us. 5, your lecture can travel beyond a singular time and place. Now, most of us got into international higher education while we're here because we actually wanted to make a difference. That's why we're here. And lectures, at their analogue best, are extraordinary. I've always believed in them, you know that. They are a powerful, revelatory moment. And it's amazing. People come together and then they part. But the problem with the analogue lecture is once it has finished, it is over. It's gone. There's no record of the content. There's no record of the excitement of that moment. But the online lecture is different. If your goal is public education, conveying powerful ideas and disseminating them to a wide audience, then the online lecture is a perfect platform. So if you work on the skills that are required to develop an online lecture, that involves, say, great content, you have great content, you need that eye contact we've talked about, you require some vocal control, screen awareness, but also a passionate delivery so that your ideas can transcend their time and transcend their place. So that means suddenly your ideas are unleashed from a classroom, unleashed from a timetable, and it becomes a transcendent moment in your professional life. The ideas travel. So they're the buoyant, wonderful ideas, why the online lecture is tremendous. Let's now get goth and depressing, and let me present the problems, but I hope also tempered by solutions. So let's start with the obvious one, and wow, this is important, team. Online lectures and online learning take more time. In the old days, which of course includes now, online learning and digitization were framed by particular models of management as increasing academic efficiency. Yeah, right. Yeah, no. Creating online lectures and online learning objects is more time-consuming than analog presentations. Full stop. Online lectures will chew up your time and they will chew up your energy. Now, Bruner's study from 2007, what a profound study this was. This changed everything. Bruner from 2007 showed that academics spend, hang on to yourself, twice as long constructing an online course as an in-person one. So double the time, double the time. So asynchronous communication tools like emails from students add, oh boy, a huge load to teaching and learning. So the cost of student flexibility is academic productivity. I'll say that again. The cost of student flexibility is academic productivity. So the way to mitigate this profound problem where just online learning can take over your life is to enact strong professional development. So really spend the time, learn the hardware, learn the software, learn the interface management, learn from the experts so it saves you time. But also know what you're doing in terms of learning outcomes. So what is the point of this learning moment? Why are you doing this digital thing? What's the point in terms of the assessment and the outcomes? So make sure your content, your knowledge is organised, and then practice, practice, practice. That increases your efficiency. 2, online learning, online learning moves the expenses for content delivery from the university to the individual teacher. So, the basic hardware and software that most universities provide for the development of born digital objects by academics is dreadful, is cheap, and doesn't do the job. So what's required for efficient online lectures and efficient online learning to be of quality is some pretty expensive kit. So academics have to spend their money on hardware and software, cameras and microphones, screens and speakers. So once more, we've got this sort of Fordist assumption from our universities about learning management systems, right? So, oh right, well the camera on your laptop, that'll do. It won't. So if you want good quality online learning, that kit, that hardware and software is going to be paid for by you. Yes, it may be a tax deduction in some systems, but that is real money that has been taken out of your family budget to buy the digital infrastructure to increase efficiency and productivity. And speaking of individuals paying the bills, 3, online lectures create atomization. Look, I have probably a buoyant and nostalgic rendering of the analogue lecture. I do believe in it. I love something, I suppose, about a group of really bright people coming together in one place and one time and sharing something. I love that. But one of the problems with the online lecture is that it does the exact opposite of that. It atomizes students. It separates students out spatially. Now, yes, we can have the chat windows, we can have the online discussion fora, but the research shows that individuals watch the lectures alone or they don't watch them at all. And therefore we lose that shared analogue learning experience. So the solution to this problem is that academics spend more time, you've guessed it, but spend time on what I call online learning socialisation. That is, we create spaces for interaction between teachers and students, but also between students and students, even more important. So the goal is to find a way, and I'll use the old cliche, to try and create an online learning community. There are great success stories in this field reported in the research. There are also profoundly failed experiments where stuff's been recorded at speed, uploaded, left to hang in the air, no one's ever seen it. But there's also fantastic examples where these bespoke online objects are integrated into curriculum and beautifully developed to summon social connections, provide, if you like, a context for learning. So a great strategy that I recommend is I separate out interfaces for learning and interfaces for communication. So that means you might have a Twitter handle for the course. That's terrific. You might have a Facebook group for the course, or a really active and more fun discussion forum that does something else beyond what a tutorial would do. So try to develop strategies to create those authentic relationships between learners. Really hard to do and takes a lot of energy and time. 4, always start with, what about your students? What about their location? What about their technology? There have been many mistakes, thousands of mistakes made in the history of online learning. And the greatest one, I think, was the assumption always that we started with the technology that was available to the academic, the technology that was available to the teacher, rather than starting with what technology is available in the house of a student. Now, that student may have a partner that's hogging broadband, or kids completing multiple assignments and downloads and uploads. Then, of course, we've got the students in RRR, regional, rural and remote. These students may be living in poverty, as many of our students are, and not able to afford the hardware and the software that we think they have. So my rule has always been that while teachers may have access to all the shiny tech, that really doesn't matter. We have to start the learning program with a deep understanding of the technology and the literacies held by our students. So remember, these students are not in a posh job in Sydney. They may be out of work in Dubbo or Tennant Creek or Geraldton. So the selection of hardware and software must be the first decision that we make. And that first decision is about the students' hardware and software, not our own. So we need to understand the sociology of your student cohort. Then the learning outcomes and the assessments can work with that. So don't have assumptions about your students. Talk to them, engage with them, understand your students, and therefore spend time creating high quality interfaces that are robust, that allow multiple pathways and modes of engaging with them. And that comes from, of course, universal design principles, and that's a great way to engage with high quality learning experiences. 5. The last great trouble, or it's a big one, online lectures can make the online lecturer disposable. This has been sort of one of the weird fears in higher education studies in the last 2 decades or so, that an academic spends all this time and money crafting an outstanding online lecture, and that's then loaded into the institutional database, and particularly if those lectures are tethered to a textbook or a particularly simplistic way of thinking about teaching and learning and knowledge, e.g. it doesn't change every year, then that lecture that you spent all those hours creating for an online experience will be used year after year after year after year after year. So you'll be paid for the first time that you developed that lecture, for the delivery of it, and you'll never be paid again. It'll be recycled in some institutions for decades. And to be honest with you, it's still a weird thing for me. I visit websites and I see stuff, lectures and stuff that I developed in the late 90s that's still being used. So the consequences of an online lecture in the dreadful corporatised time of our universities is that you're going to be paid once and your online lecture is going to be continued to be used for years. And that's where really your commitment as a teacher to deliver edgy, passionate, current content is undercut by your role as a university worker who's casualised or on a really short-term contract. But unlike in the analogue days where you could be replaced as a lecturer, right? So you would be lecturing one year and you may be replaced the following year, but you'd be replaced by another human. So at least someone was getting paid. Whereas now you spend all this time doing this fantastic online lecture and then you're never paid again and no one else is either. So this online lecture can be spectacular. It can change and bend and transform how we think about learning. How amazing! And that is spectacular. Students from a diversity of backgrounds can be scaffolded through my Octopus model of learning. Universal design can create those spaces in and through content. And as shown by the TED Talks, all sorts of new audiences can be found. But I think the warning from the TED Talks also needs to be acknowledged. Of the 10 most viewed TED Talks, 7 of them are focused on inspiring people to change themselves. Not climate change, not food security, not war, not poverty, not violence, not militarism. 7 of the 10 lectures are self-help. What can I do to create a better me? The online lecture in our universities must have a higher calling. So what can we do to create a better society? And yes, the online lecture has a powerful role in that project. I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.